Hello, everyone. Welcome to the stream. Happy to see all of you here. So I'm Muli. I'm a VP of R&D in Amplication, and with me today, joining is Daniele, which is a principal engineer in Amplication, and we are very happy to be here. Hi, Danny.
Hi, Muli. Hi, everyone.
So what we want to do today is to tell you a bit about the application, tell you a bit about our plugin system, and then from there talk about the actual Octernship task, show you a few relevant resources, and answer some questions. So that's the plan, and I hope you'll all enjoy the stream. So first, about us application. So we're an application and open source dev tool or dev framework for generating, for quickly generating quality backend services with Node.js and Nest. What we aim to do mostly is to save developers time on all the boilerplate code that we keep repeating again and again in every service and in every application that we develop. We feel our motto is just code what matters. So we feel that developers should focus on their own core business logic and their core business in general, and not to struggle again and again with the same boilerplate code for services, for REST, for GraphQL, and for all of these things. And we also give standardization, right? So if you generate your services in application, you can ensure that all your services will be similar in their structure, in their technologies. So it makes working in a cross-team and cross-service environment much faster, and ensures high standards of your code. So that is our mission. With that mission, we have a few philosophies, and one of them is that we are a somewhat opinionated framework. So we are generating code in a specific way that is, of course, according to best practices. We use what we feel are the best frameworks out there for Node, like Nest and Prisma and Passport and other frameworks. So you get to enjoy the latest and greatest, and hopefully you like our opinion on how the services should look like. And maybe I'll share my screen for a second. Okay. So as what I want to present today is a bit about how application works and show you a bit about our plugin system. So let's dive right in. Of course, if you like the project and you like what we're doing, you're all very welcome to look at our open source repo and, of course, to give us a star. So thanks in advance for that. I think we can jump right in, or perhaps talk a bit from where I just mentioned that we are quite an opinionated framework, but we still understand that different people and different companies do want to impact the code and not just get the code as is according to how we create it. And that is where our plugin system comes into play. So when you create, I will demo it in a second, but when you create services in application, you can choose, I will do it live with you, you can choose which plugins are installed, and those plugins are able to interact with how we generate code. So the code generation process is like a series of steps. I will show you more in a second. And in each of these steps, a plugin can step in and make changes to what we are generating by default. So let's maybe show a quick demo, and then I think it will be easier as a starting point, and then discuss the task a bit more in depth. So Here I'm in application, and I will generate a service. I pre-connected this instance of my workspace to a Git repo that is currently empty. So I have nothing in the repo except for the README file. And I will just generate our first service of today. So let's do something like that. I can, of course, connect to GitHub, which I already am. I can choose if I want my service to have a GraphQL API and or a REST API. And if I also want to generate a basic React admin UI to interact with the service, I will choose to have all of them. We can choose a monorepo or a polyrepo. Again, I don't want to go into all the details of everything, but we aim to support various kinds of development. And then you can choose which database you want to work with. I'll go with the default, which is Postgres. And these, by the way, are also plugins, right? So one first hint of plugins is already this screen where each of these databases is actually a plugin that right now by choosing Postgres, I'm actually choosing to use the Postgres DB plugin for this service. And I'll just start with an empty repo and include authorization, which is one of the great things that we do for you. So and you'll see in a second, we don't only structure all your APIs, but we can also give you authentication and authorization for these APIs. So let's add that as well. That by default will generate a user entity. So you can see here the service is ready, but not yet built. I already have a default user entity, which is for the authorization. So it has roles, and there is support here to add roles, and then later when I look at various operations, I can choose later on which permissions for which roles are available on each endpoint. So we get that by default, and I will create one more entity just for the sake of the demo. So let's create a customer entity. Just add here, I don't know, a name and an address. The system kind of guesses by the name of the field the type, but you can, of course, select the type and add your own, like if it's unique, if it's required, add Prisma custom attributes. So, but let's start with the basics. So I create another entity. I can see all my changes here, and let's do the first build of this service. So first, let me add a message here, and let's see what happens. So right now, application is starting the build. There is a lot of information here that I will not necessarily cover, but you can see that it installs various plugins. For example, the authorization plugin, because I chose that I want to have authorization, and the Postgres plugin, because I chose I want to have that as well. And it's currently going through all the code generation process and pushing my changes to GitHub. So one important thing about application is that we are not locking you in any way. The code is yours, everything is yours. You're not tied to the platform. You can make any changes you want to the code and then go back to application and keep editing the parts like entities and CRUD that you do via application. And let's see what we got here. So as you can see, I have an open pull request now on my repo. And the pull request contains quite a lot of files because it's the first pull request. So I have everything I need here for a fully operational service that exposes the CRUD operations for the two entities I have, the user and the customer, with REST and with GraphQL and an admin UI for it. I will not go into all the details, of course, it's a lot of files, but let's just go ahead and merge this pull request in. So I'm merging this, and already I have my code here. You can see very high level. It's a monorepo, so there's apps, and then there is one for the service and one for the admin UI. And in the service, there is everything you can expect, like the Prisma DB schema, for example, that represents the entities that I chose. And all the controllers and resolvers and everything you could expect. we put our generated code inside the base folders, and the actual controllers resolvers are quite empty. They inherit from the base, so you can add your own code, customized code here without overriding anything that we did. So it's quite easy to add your custom code and still go back to application and make changes as you want. Maybe I will put the other screen on the side there, just so I can see if you have any interesting questions here. So that is the basic code generation, and that's in. Now I want from there to show you a quick demo of what a plugin is. So until this point, we generated code which is quite vanilla, let's call it, the basic of what the application generates. But behind the scenes, this service does have some plugins already installed. So by choosing that I want to have authentication authorization, that actually meant that I chose these two plugins to be already installed. And of course, the Postgres DB already installed. As you can see, we have like a dozen or 14 plugins here already. And part of what we want to achieve with the Octernship project is to enrich our plugins library. And that's why your test task is to generate a very simple plugin, because that resembles a lot of the actual work that the Octerns that will be selected will be doing with application. So for the purposes of this demo, I will take a simple additional plugin. So we have a plugin, Swagger API Body. It adds decorators for Swagger that gives the structure of the payload, right, in the Swagger UI. So I'll just install that. As you can see, I have the changes here that I added this. Give it a name. And this is the interesting bit, because I will now rebuild, and this is my only change from the previous build. So you can see here that it's building again. Now it's also installing the API Body plugin, right? And I was hoping that let's see that. Just a second. Demo live. Oh, give it one more try. I think we have a problem with that plugin version, but give it one more try, and if not, we'll. The plugins are not all ours, so it doesn't always give us everything we hoped for. Let's give it one more try. If not, I'll try with another plugin. Sorry for that. I guess that's a good real-life demo. Not good. Okay, let's do something else. Sorry about that. So let's try the Prettier plugin just for the demo. In the meantime, while it's building, or maybe let's wait for it. That will give us a bit more changes than the previous, but now we added a plugin that formats the code with Prettier. So again, there will be more changes than the plugin I was intending to install, but it's still a good enough demo to see how plugins interact with the generated code. So you can see here that it basically just added to the package JSON and added a new file with the Prettier settings. So it added it to the package JSON of the service and of the admin UI. And that is all the change. So basically, that was the point of this demo, to show how adding a single plugin after you already have the code in place just makes the changes, and you can very easily see that these changes are just related to that plugin. If I will merge it and then remove the plugin and commit again, I will just get these changes again removed. So that is the concept of plugins in a very high level. And that is how that works. So let's dive into the plugins a bit more, right? So we saw a demo of how it works. We saw how the plugin affects the code. But what really happens there? So you can see that there we have very good docs, and everything is also mentioned in your Octernship task with links to the relevant docs. But this explains both how you use plugin, but also the architecture. And again, I won't go into everything because I'm hoping you are reading this as part of your task. But we have, I'll show you the code generation, which is done by a component called DSG, Data Service Generator, has a series of events. Maybe it's a bit small to see. So a series of events that happen. And each of these events, a plugin can decide he wants to intervene in. And for each of the events, you can decide to intervene in the before and or the after stage of this event. So the DSG part for each of these boxes does some code generation, and the plugin can either come in before and or after each of these steps and make changes. So as, it's all documented here. Again, I won't go into all the details, but you can see here the signatures and how you can interact before and after. You can decide that you want to skip the default behavior, for example. So you can go in the before event and tell the DSG, I don't want anything that you generate for this event. The plugin, will handle all of it. So that's, for example, skip default behavior. And you have all the documentation on all the options that are available for you as a plugin developer. There is also a part in the guide here which will be specifically useful to you guys and girls for how to create a plugin with instructions and how to test your plugin, which I think is one of the most frequently asked questions that I saw about testing plugins. We did release an ability to test a plugin locally, because usually plugins should be published to NPM in order to be used in the wild, in production. And we need to add them to approve them in our repo as well. But if you want to have a local plugin and test it, of course, without NPM, you have instructions here on how you can run your plugin locally as part of running Amplication locally. So let's talk about the task for a second, right? And now that we talked about what plugins are, and again, the important part for you to understand is that what I showed here, that the code generation is basically a series of steps, and the plugin can intervene before and or after any of these steps. Luckily for you guys and for us as well, because we love open source, we are open source. So we have the plugins repository that is also linked in your task, and you can see all the plugins we already have, and you can see the code. So you have plenty of examples of how it really works. For example, we installed the Prettier plugin now in the demo, and we can see, again, in very high level, I'll zoom a bit, that a plugin, it implements the application plugin interface, and it registers to the events that are interesting for that plugin. Each plugin registers for its own event. So it registers for the create server event for after that event, and the create server package JSON before that event, etc. Each of them is registered with a function, and then the DSG will call these functions when this event arrives. So after the create server finishes on the DSG, it will call this plugin after create server. And in any of these functions, you can do things like add files to the generated code, change part of the code generation. So that is the point of, that is how plugins intervene with the code generation process. And like I said, it's all open source, so you can see quite a few examples here of relevant plugins. In addition to that, So I showed you the docs earlier, and again, there is quite a bit of useful information here. There is also a great blog post by Amit from the core team, which is also linked in your Octernship task, which is a more verbal explanation about how our plugins work. So I find it sometimes a bit easier than reading just technical documentation. And this actually walks you through a step-by-step example of how plugins work. So it explains about the plugins, about the events, about the skip default behavior, about the hierarchy that I showed earlier. And then it takes you through, I think, the Postgres plugin or maybe the MySQL plugin. Yeah, the MySQL plugin. So it actually looks at our real MySQL plugin and it starts breaking down what's going on here and how that plugin works. So I think this blog post, which I linked on the Octernship task, is also a very good resource for you. And I think, let me see what else we have here. So this is the task, which you've probably all seen. Yeah, there's one more thing I need to add, but so the task explains, and let's maybe see that from the generated code. So we generated code together earlier, right? And I showed you how we added on this service the plugin and that example. But let's get into the task itself. So the task itself speaks about the count, implementing the count in the API controller, in the REST controller. So you can see now that I generated code that, for example, I have the customer entity that was generated for me. And if I go into the base library where we generate most of the code, you can see that the service base does have a count. So the service exposes the count for each entity already. That's nice. And then if I go to the GraphQL resolver base, you can see that this already exposes a meta query that uses the service count. So if you use GraphQL to interact with your service, you can't get the count of customers in this case. However, if I go to the controller base, to the REST controller, you will not be able to find any reference of count here. So basically, right now, Amplication generates the REST controller without exposing the count in REST. And that is the heart of the task, right? I explained here. The task is to create a plugin that will will expose the count method that exists on the service, also on the REST controllers that we generate. So these base REST controllers, if you did everything successfully, should expose another API function with all the relevant decorators and everything, and to expose the count to a REST user. So that is the task itself. And one more thing before we go to some other maybe questions or things that I saw that were asked repeatedly. In order to get started with all of this, other than everything I talked about the plugins and testing the plugins, of course, in order to test the plugins, you need to run the application app or the application services locally, right? So this, I'm using here our real production service, but of course, in order to test your plugins, you would need to have application running locally at your laptop or PC. So I had it open. Yeah, here it is. So under our repo, which I will remind you again that it's a good practice to start our repo. So under our repo, you can find in the README the part that talks about development here, and it gives you the prerequisites, and this is where you would be most interested in. So this is what you need to do to run the application platform locally. So for example, and it's all using Docker, so I have to start on that screen, but this is an example on my machine. I have the Docker desktop running. I can see the services running. So this means that I have application running locally. If I did everything right, then when I go to localhost first to 8080, I will be able to see the Kafka running, which we use to interact between services. And that green dot here is the first thing you would want to see after you spin up everything. So if you went through all of this and everything is running, then the first thing you want to see is that locally Kafka is running and you have a green dot, meaning that everything is ready. So that is a first or second step after running these commands. Like I said, you should see on Docker that you have these components, the Kafka, Kafka UI, Zookeeper, and the DB running. So that's what you would expect. And then if that all works well and you ran all the services, then you should have, like I have here, a local copy of Amplication running now from my laptop with all the services running. I can interact with it, and that gives me the basic ability to debug Amplication, to contribute code to Amplication, if you are into contributing to open source in general, and of course, in particular, to the great open source project called the Amplication. And this will be a good starting point, or the mandatory starting point, in order to actually get to testing your plugin, as it mentions here. So when it says how to test a plugin, of course, it assumes that you're already running Amplication locally, like I just showed, and then you can develop your plugin and bring it in locally. The last hint I will give about running it locally, other than what I said so far, is that and I think the README kind of points to it. You need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, you don't need these 5. But you need eventually 5 services running. I can show you here. I have the build manager running, local data service generator running, a pull request service, the server itself, and the client. So that's the 5 services you would want to have running. And if they're all running, like I have them, you should expect to run the Amplication platform locally. And from there, that's, again, the starting point for developing a plugin and following the guide on how to test your plugin and how to develop your plugin. So that is the entry point to all of that. And before maybe we go to other questions, I will just say that the common pitfalls, other than the things I've mentioned already, I think that the 2 most common questions that I saw so far, okay. So the 2 common questions that came up a lot were the first one was about the versions. So our platform, in order to run it locally, I can recommend specifically, instead of just searching and searching, on my machine, I'm using Node version 18.3.0. So I just recommend that you would use that Node version. You can use NVM or similar to use that Node version. And I'm using NPM 8.11.0. So again, I'm not saying that that is the only combination that works, and definitely over Node 16 and over, I don't remember which version of NPM, it will work for you as well. But just like a tip for me, that's what I have on my machine, and it's better tested. So Node 18.3.0 and NPM 8.11.0, I can promise you that you will have no problems with those specifically. And I think the other common question that came up a lot is about testing. And I think I showed you the main resources in our docs about how to test your plugin. And there is a way to have it all locally without needing to use NPM at all. So I think I pretty much covered everything I wanted to cover, and I guess we can open it up to other questions that were not covered. I will say, though, that, first of all, there might be questions that will be a bit out of scope for, or too in-depth for this platform. So the task itself invites you to our Discord, where the core team monitors and helps you with more in-depth questions, because of course we can't use the stream to really dive into deep technical questions. And the second thing is that, and that happens on Discord too, part of the task itself, or part of what we are looking to see here, is the ability to learn and tackle the technical concepts and reading the documentation and understanding the documentation. So we avoid some questions on purpose because we don't want to spoon feed you with the answers, because that's part of the evaluation, honestly. We want to see that you are able to cope with the documentation and the technical prerequisites that are required, because we hope that the selected interns will have, will have a very good journey with us. And I think that it can be very cool for anyone to have eventually plugins that will be his, that are running inside the application production. They're already quite widely used. We have over 10K stars, so I think it's a very nice star to put on your belt, let's say, to say that one of the plugins that are used in application live is your creation, and that is the chance that we are offering here, on top of course, interacting with people like Daniela here, that is a real pleasure to work with, and has taught me a lot about a lot. So that's some of the benefits that we offer here. So I think we can switch to some questions. I was too concentrated on what I'm presenting. So then if you picked up any questions that you're already interested in, go ahead.
Yeah, I think we saw a couple of questions coming through. We already answered through the chat, but just to iterate, I think there was some questions around the .env files being created. And yeah, of course, we do create files like the .env as the template files. Yeah, that is the question indeed. That the meaning of that .env for a generated code is at least to summarize all of the environment variable that you expect your service to use, and it doesn't need to contain secrets. So we highly recommend to use a .env.local as part of the your repository is already ignoring in the git ignore generated by application as well. So other questions around the test and debugging that you already touched, in particular about the need to run application. So in most of the scenarios, when you debug like a plugin or an add-on for any like potential project or platform out there, you have like really strict rules that you need to follow. The good in application is being pretty new and fully open source, you can leverage the actual application platform locally. That will open the door for you to also debug. So if you want to understand a bit better why your plugin doesn't work, running the full thing with the actual application running locally will help you out. So I highly recommend that one. And there were a couple of other questions about creating about credentials in general, so probably I would need a bit more details, but if I did understand correctly, there is a question from Pri about MongoDB and creating an account on behalf of a user. So when you select a plugin and you use a plugin like a database plugin like MongoDB or Postgres of MySQL, what application will generate is the default and most basic setup. So you will have like the Prisma, that is the ORM that is shipped with application. They will have migrations, and those will be in charge of creating the master user and the database. And they usually the details about username and password are defining the .env, and of course are temporary for you to use. So hopefully that will help you to log into the database. I hope that I tackled your question actually.
Yeah, I'll just say that for the generated code and the generated database, I didn't show it, but inside the plugins, each plugin has settings. So there's a JSON settings inside there's a button on plugin called settings, and each plugin developer can decide which settings he wants for his plugin. So for a DB plugin, for example, if you look live on our production cloud, you will see that when you install a DB, the settings have things like the port and the user and password. And of course, that's for generated code. So we generated with those users' password, but that's where you get it from for the generated code.
And yeah, I think a couple of more questions were around the actual running application locally and logging into the local platform. If you have to set up your GitHub locally, or if you need the credentials. So locally in theory, we support basic authentication and the GitHub configuration. Of course, to get the full deal, we'd recommend to configure GitHub locally. You can find the guide in the docs website. I will probably pop the link here, so it will be easy to find. But yeah, as anything else, if you have any question about the documentation, there is the big community on Discord that can help and we can interact on. So I'm gonna just pop the link in here. That will actually have a bit of a plus that you get a taste of what the authentication and the integration with GitHub look like for an auth0 integration. So there is another question about getting more details about the events and how they are used in the DSG. So I think these are really well documented in the docs, as Muli showcased, and in the blog from Amit, that we have a link already in the chat. We could go a bit more in details, but we will probably nail too much down into details and get a bit of lose a bit of the trade. So what I would say is, imagine that you have the DSG is our code generator, and if you are familiar with a concept like the middleware, when something happened before and after a specific action, our events are built with the same principle. It's not a middleware in any way related to middlewares that you might have or might not have been working with, like Express or others, but the concept, the pattern of middleware. So you always have a before and an after action for each event. And one event could be related to the generation of the .NET, sorry, the .env file, as has been mentioned before. So if you want to do something before to feed the generation, or if you want to do something to modify the output, you can do that through these functions, these middlewares across the events.
Yeah, and other than the diagram I showed, inside the docs there's actually a reference per each event that tells you per event what it is, what it does, what are the parameters for this event. And most of them are quite straightforward. Like you can imagine that, like there is event for creating the service, and then an event for creating the GraphQL resolver, an event for creating the REST API controller. So each of these has an event, and you just need to find the event that fits what your plugin needs to do. I think the blog also mentioned, maybe it's not directly related, but that you can take the generated code and without application, just make the changes manually on it that you would want your plugin to make, and then kind of reverse engineer it. I understand what are the changes you've made in order to support, like in this case, the count, to expose the count on the REST API controller, and then from there trying to trace back what are the events that are interesting for me and how do I make these events generate the code that I did manually. So that is our kind of recommended pattern for it.
I think we go asked to yeah, I think we just post the link to an example of the plugin event in the chat. So hopefully, Nishant, sorry, that might help you. That is not what you are asking about the entity controller, but is an example. Is you can check on the menu. And yeah, let's see. We don't see any question about like the setup of your local machine, but as Muli mentioned, Node.js and of course Node LTS is the version that is fully supported. In terms of like when you need to set up your local machine for running container, that is the default way of running application locally. You can use Docker Desktop. If you are a student, of course, you have like the free license from Docker. Otherwise, if you're familiar, you can also use Podman Desktop, that is the open source creation of the Docker engine. So those are two tools that can be used for as well. And I think
we kind of covered most of what we wanted to cover. You're all welcome to our Discord community, where there are more resources and other community members also help there, and of course the core team. So we can definitely continue. A lot of questions were answered on the Discord channel already, so check that out. Yeah, and thank you everyone for joining and listening, and for submitting your submissions. And we look forward to getting great Octerns and great results.
Good, fun, guys. See you soon.